The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody. I'm gonna wait a couple minutes just to see if a few more folks roll in here, but thanks for joining us on the first virtual Vermont Forest Health Meeting webinar series. Yeah, we've got a few great talks coming in the coming weeks, and I'm excited to get this started today. And this is, as I think I put out in the email, this is going to be a regularly occurring series for the next 4 weeks, Wednesdays at 9 a.m. on this GoToWebinar platform. I want to say, first and foremost, welcome to everybody that's able to view this today. I know there were some caps with the registration, but I'm glad that the folks that are able to view this can do so. And to let folks know that if you have friends or colleagues that were not able to log into this today, that these webinars will be available for on-demand viewing. The details of that will be forthcoming in a couple weeks, but they will be through the ourvermontwoods.org website. And not only can you view them there, but you'll also be able to get the credits that you're seeking as well after you view the webinar. So great news all around with that stuff. My name is Josh Hallman. For those of you that don't know me, I'm a forest health specialist with FPR, and I'm glad to be able to help put this together. Obviously, we would have loved to have the in-person meeting that we all have attended and loved for the past many years. But I'm grateful that we're able to have this alternative venue for sharing this information. And a special thanks really goes out to UVM Extension and Cape 4 in particular for helping get the details of this figured out so quickly and transition from what was supposed to be an in-person meeting to a webinar series in a matter of weeks. So a great deal of thanks go to them and to Kate too. Something that's probably on the minds of many folks is credits for this. So far we have secured SAF and CFE credits, ISA as well, and pesticide applicator credits as well. In order to obtain those credits, you'll need to fill out a survey at the end of the webinar. So when you click out of the webinar, when you leave it, there should be a pop-up that comes up. You should fill out the questions there to get the credits that you're seeking, and fill out that information as best you can, and we'll take care of the rest from there. Hopefully getting at least SAF credits processed within a week. ISA and pesticide applicator credits may take a little longer, but we'll still be able to do that. And as far as I know, the credit numbers, it's one full credit for SAF. I believe that's the same for ISA and pesticide applicator. And certificates will be sent out to you once you've completed those surveys and the credits have been processed. Any other questions about that, feel free to shoot me an email. I know my email, some folks had written me saying that there was a little extra letter in the email address. So my email is joshua.halman@vermont.gov, and feel free to shoot me those questions. Speaking of questions, today, after the PowerPoint is presented, we'll have some time for questions, hopefully. And if you see on the right side of your screen there's a drop-down for questions. And if you can fill that drop-down in with your questions, I will pull from those at the end of the webinar and ask Emily those, and we'll get some responses for you guys that way. I think that is all the logistical stuff I have for running this. Basically, I'm going to close my camera down here shortly and hand this over to our presenter today. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Emily Fusco, who's joining us from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst today, where she's a postdoctoral research associate. And she also works with the Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change group that's based out of there. And so she's going to be talking to us today about the implications of climate change for invasive species and give some information about the Northeastern RISCC network. So without further ado, thanks, Emily.
All right. So it is great to be here today talking with all of you. I am disappointed that I didn't get to meet all of you up in Vermont, but this webinar will have to do for now, and maybe next year I'll make my way up there and finally get to meet some of you all in person. So I, as Josh said, am a postdoctoral research associate at UMass Amherst. My research mostly focuses on invasive species and fire and kind of that intersection there. But for today, I'm going to be talking more about my work with the Northeast Risk Management Network. So that's the Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Management Network. And this is a large group of us that work as a part of this network to bring invasive species and climate change information to invasive species managers in the Northeast. So we're going to start talking just a little bit about invasive species. So we know that these species are already bad enough just dealing with them on their own. So kudzu, spotted lanternfly, pythons down in Florida, these are all problematic species and they cost us upwards of millions and millions of dollars every year for managing these species. So it may feel like kind of a lot to now think about adding climate change into the mix. So these ideas of increasing CO2 and temperatures and sea level rise or hurricanes and wind disturbance. So these are all things that we know are probably going to interact with our invasive species, but it can feel like a lot to think about how to deal with these new interactions. So we've got enough on our plate already dealing with invasive species. So adding climate change is a big ask, but we know that with invasion management, that a lot of the most effective management happens on the early end of this invasion curve. So before species get into an area or before they're already really abundant in an area. And so we're hoping here that by learning how to incorporate climate change into our invasive species management, that we can kind of work on the prevention side in a lot of these management strategies, and then also learn from other people who are already dealing with invasive species that we may have to deal with in the future. So a brief outline of this talk. I'm going to spend the first half of it or so talking about some specific interactions that we expect to see with invasive species and climate change. So those include rising temperatures, range shifting invasive species, how we expect climate variability to create disturbance that we're going to also have to deal with in terms of our management, how plants might be responding to rising CO2. I'll talk a little bit about some things that we know we don't know yet and why those things are also important. And then the last part of the talk will be about the Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Management Network, so RISC specifically, and some of the things that RISC is doing to help you all deal with managing invasive species in light of climate change. All right, so moving into this first idea of rising temperatures. So we know that with climate change, we're already experiencing and will experience or even further rises in our annual temperatures. And these rises in temperatures are virtually certain. And what you may or may not already know is that there's a lot of evidence already that rising temperatures are going to favor terrestrial invasive plants. So just a disclaimer, I'm going to be talking mostly about terrestrial invasive plants because that is largely what our lab focuses on. So hopefully this is an important area for you all for forest management with some less focus on aquatic species or marine species. So thinking about terrestrial invasive plants, we have this meta-analysis here from Liu and colleagues in 2017. So what a meta-analysis is essentially an analysis of analyses. And it has a lot more power than any one study alone, and we can kind of glean more insights about general trends using these types of meta-analyses. And so what this is showing here is our native and invasive, so native in blue, invasive in red, their responses to elevated temperature. So the way that you can read this here is we're looking at effect size on the x-axis, and then this dotted line up at 0. So anything that doesn't cross the dotted line is a significant effect. So for elevated temperature, what we're seeing is that our invasive plants, they are responding significantly more positively. So because it's to the right of the line, it's a more positive response to these warming temperatures. And that is significantly more than our native plants. And so the next question is, so why are our rising temperatures favoring our invasive plants. So one reason might have to do with different phenologies. So we know from climate change that a lot of our species might start to leaf out earlier. And so this is an example here of a photo of the same location in May 30th of 1868 versus May 30th of 2005. So this comes from a study from Miller, Rushing and colleagues. And this is in Lowell, Massachusetts. And they're showing here the difference in green up between these 2 years. So you have on the left almost no leaves, or possibly no leaves on our deciduous trees, versus on the right in 2005, where by May 30th, everything is totally green. So why might our invasive plants be able to take advantage of this kind of warming? And one hypothesis is that there might be some phenological plasticity in our invasive plants that our native plants don't have. So here, when we talk about plasticity, we're talking about the ability for an individual organism or an individual plant to acclimate or change for the warming climate. And the reason why invasive plants might be able to do this is because if they are responding to temperature cues, so the actual warming temperatures rather than static cues, which are things like day length, then they might be able to respond to warming temperature when our native plants are still sticking with these day length cues. And there's some evidence that this might be happening. So this study comes from looking at 587 different plant species in Concord, Massachusetts, and they're looking at a shift in flowering time between from 1900 to present. So this is a study from 2010 by Willis and colleagues. And what they found is that when they compared the native versus invasive plants, so this bottom bar here, the invasive plants over this time period were able to shift their flowering time by up to 14 days. So they're clearly responding to some kind of cue in our climate shifts. Versus these native and non-native, so they're non-invasive non-natives, they don't have any kind of significant change in their flowering time. And so this is some evidence here that our invasives may be more plastic, and so they're able to increase in abundance and take advantage of these different phenological cues. Another hypothesis is this priority effects hypothesis. So another reason why our invasives may be able to take advantage of these rising temperatures and longer growing season. And so this hypothesis you can kind of think of as this early bird catches the worm. So our invasives may be greening up earlier. And usually with this strategy of greening up earlier, there's some kind of trade-off. The trade-off being that you might be more susceptible to late season frost events, but what you get is that you may have more access to resources if you are able to green up earlier. So more nutrients, and you have a longer growing season. But with a changing climate, when we have these warmer temperatures earlier in the year, there may be less of a trade-off. So these invasive plants that green up earlier could get all of the benefits with less of that risk of a late frost, for example. And we do know that several of our Northeast invasive plants have an earlier spring green up than a lot of our natives. So some of these examples here are barberry or garlic mustard, the invasive honeysuckle and buckthorn. And in all of these photos, you can see that they're some of the first plants to green up in the spring. So they may be able to take advantage of those earlier warm temperatures. And so to give you an example that's not plant specific, but also important for forests, we have that some forest pests may have longer or more life cycles with warming weather. So the example here is from mountain pine beetle. So this is a native pest in the western US, but there was a study done by Bentz and colleagues in 2010. And what they're showing here on the right is the probability that this species is able to overwinter from 1961 to, I believe, 1990. And then the probability of overwintering again based on climate models from 2071 to 2100. And you can see in those two graphs that are in those two maps that the probability of overwintering increases as temperature increases. So there's less blue and green in that bottom map there. And so if there's an increased probability of successful overwintering, this can also mean that some pests might gain traction and you could have more outbreaks from these pests. So we expect that generally for a lot of these species, warmer climates will help them in their life cycles. So the main idea here with this rising temperatures and earlier phenology is that invasives do tend to be more responsive to warming temperatures, and this is going to increase their growth and abundance. So yeah, compared to native plants, our invasives are likely going to be able to take advantage of these kinds of temperature trends. Right. So moving on to the next part, we'll talk a little bit about how rain shifts and climate change may help our invasive species again. So the idea here is that climate change is happening very quickly, and this is going to favor species that can disperse really quickly because they're going to need to track their climate space. So this combination of climate conditions that they need to be in order to survive. So this is an example of how quickly the Massachusetts climate, for example, is changing. So we have our historical average in 1960 to 1999, where we're at currently in Massachusetts. So looking at climate similar to northern New Jersey. And then we have two emission scenarios for what our climate might look like in 2070 to 2099, either something down in Maryland or South Carolina. But the idea is that to keep up with this kind of climate, plant species would need to move around 800 miles. So that's a really long ways to go in a very short period of time. And so you might be wondering, how fast can species disperse? So for our native species, we have this study here from Beckage and colleagues. It was done in 2008, where they looked at the migration of northern hardwoods upslope in Vermont. So this was a study done in the Green Mountain National Forest. And what they found is that over this 40 years, so from 64 to 2004, the northern hardwoods did expand upslope, and the boreal forest on these slopes did contract from the lower elevations, but that movement was around 600 feet. So they went around 600 feet in 40 years. And that's not very fast, especially if we're thinking about how quickly climate change is happening. But on the flip side of that, a lot of our invasive plants and animals are deliberately moved around and introduced and spread by people. So here we have a study from Leon and colleagues from 2013, where they looked at thousands of non-native, invasive, and noxious weeds in the US. And what you can see here is they're all introduced by people. Most of them are introduced deliberately by people. And even those plants and animals that are being accidentally introduced by people are still being introduced by people and have that advantage. So we know that people are way better dispersers of plants than plants are by themselves. So plants that are relying just on their more natural dispersal mechanisms, whether that be wind dispersal or dispersal from animals, while that will help them move to some extent, we have people moving invasive plants and selling them in nurseries, and invasive plants tracking along boats or cars or boots, and that is going to help these plants disperse a lot more quickly than a lot of our native plants. And based on this idea, so we expect that more invasive species are going to shift into the Northeast. So this is based on analysis of over 800 invasive plants that exist in the US, and looking at suitable climate space for these species in the future. And we see that in a lot of the Northeast, there's going to be an increase of around 75 to 100 new invasives that we aren't currently dealing with, but we'll have suitable climate for in the future. And this is looking out to 2050. And so they'll have the suitable climate space, and it's also likely that people will help them get to these new places. So the take-home point here is that species ranges are shifting, and that's for natives and invasive species. But our invasive species that are cultivated and released by people are going to have this huge advantage because they'll be able to disperse to new areas more quickly and more easily than a lot of our native species. Right, so thinking about climate change and disturbance. So first I'm going to show you here, this is a study from Seidel et al. So they did a global meta-analysis looking at 6 different forest disturbances. So those included pathogens, fire, drought, wind, insects, and snow and ice. And so these are all potential disturbances that a forest might experience. And they found in their analysis that there would be a likely increase in disturbance from 5 out of 6 of these different disturbances. The only one where they didn't expect to see an increase was with snow and ice, which makes sense considering that our climate is warming. But for these other 5 disturbances, they do expect that there will be some level of increase globally. So to think a little bit more about that, one example we have for wind disturbance is this likely increase in hurricane intensity in the Northern Atlantic. So this comes from Knutson and colleagues, and what they're showing here is there is a trend in the LMI, so lifetime maximum intensity of a hurricane over the past 20 to 30 years. And so we do expect to see this trend continue and that we're going to have more severe hurricanes in our North Atlantic hurricane season. And so why is that important? With these hurricanes, we expect that there will be native tree mortality with these extreme events. So this example comes from Brown and colleagues in 2011, and what they're looking at here is native tree canopy cover, both before and after Hurricane Katrina. So you can see there between 2003 and 2006, when Hurricane Katrina hit in this top right graph, our tree canopy cover greatly decreased. And then if you look at this bottom right graph, you can see also between that time, the understory plants greatly increased. So when there's a disturbance like this, as many of you probably know, it creates open space for understory plants to take over. Here, they were particularly worried about increase in invasive tallow plants. So invasive species generally respond positively to disturbance. So the expectation is that in a lot of these cases, these extreme events will open up new space for invasives to move in and take advantage of that disturbance. One thing we don't know is whether this kind of increase in understory invasives will be a permanent shift in the ecosystem, or if the trees will be able to eventually recover. But for a lot of invasive species, they have an ability to outcompete our natives, and that includes native trees. So like sapling regeneration can often be harmed by non-native invasive species. All right, so the take-home point here is that climate variability may create some novel disturbance, and this is likely going to harm our native ecosystems and provide an opening for our invasive species. All right. So another component of our changing climate is going to be, and already is, these rising levels of atmospheric CO2. So this graph here shows the carbon dioxide concentration at Mauna Loa, Hawaii, that observatory from 1960 to a little after 2010. And what we're seeing is this increase from, slightly under 320 parts per million to around 400. And we all know that plants like carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide should help plants grow. And that's true. So plants do better with more CO2. And you may or may not recognize this photo here, but this comes from and was promoted by Exxon and the Heartland Institute. So our oil companies here promoting this idea that increased CO2 is actually green because it helps plants grow. So they're showing the sapling growth at ambient levels, so current levels of carbon dioxide concentration up to 450 parts per million concentration, and want you to think about how much better these plants are doing. And it's true, plants do better with more CO2. Our trees are growing, up to 50% more, flowering herbs up to 15% more, and each of those, in addition to increased growth, also seem to be more productive too. So more flowers, more fruits, and more seed mass. And so while this may seem like a positive thing for plants, there's huge variation by different species, and we don't know a lot about many plants, but what we do know is that when you compare how well native plants and invasive plants are doing with increases in carbon dioxide, what we're seeing is that terrestrial invasive plants are doing significantly better than our native plants. So this is again from that Liu et al. Meta-analysis. Only now we're showing this elevated CO2 option where they looked at 45 studies of native plants with elevated CO2 and 46 studies with invasive plants that had elevated CO2. And while both groups, the natives and invasives, did seem to do better with higher concentrations of CO2, our invasive plants are doing significantly better than our native plants. And so we're seeing this, that they're both doing well, but the relative improvements do matter. And our invasive plants are going to be able to take advantage of this even more so than our natives. And in addition to them just growing and responding more positively, there's also the potential that our invasive plants may also become bigger and harder to kill. So this comes from a study in 2004 where they looked at Canada thistle growth under ambient CO2 conditions and future CO2 conditions. And what we're seeing on the left here is, this is an herbicide study. So on the left, they treated this Canada thistle experiment with herbicide, and they also did the same thing on the right. But what we're seeing on the right is that the Canada thistle continued to thrive even after herbicide application under future increased CO2 concentration. And one possible reason for this is that with more CO2, the Canada thistle in this study was able to allocate more growth to roots and underground biomass. So even though there was herbicide application on the top part of the plants, on all the leaves, it was able to regrow because it had a lot of growth already established underground. And that was not the case with the ambient CO2 conditions. And so one thing that we may need to look out for with climate change and this increase in CO2 is going to be these hardier invasive plants. So we may need to rethink kind of our herbicide application methods and in order to make sure that they're still effective with future CO2 conditions. So the take-home point here is that all plants do better with higher CO2, but these relative improvements do matter, and our invasive plants are likely going to do even better than our native plants with more CO2. And then also that we need to watch out for hardier invasives. So they may not respond to our herbicide treatments in the same way that they have been in the past. So we might have to rethink our methods for treating these invasives. Right. So even with all of these interactions that we know between invasive species and climate change in terms of warming temperatures and CO2 and this increase in disturbance and changes in phenology, one of the things we know that we don't know is still how all of these things are going to interact. These are really complicated processes, as you all know. So while it's simpler to think about these simple interactions, it can be more complicated to think about how all of these things are going to act on a forest ecosystem as a whole. So we've still got a lot of work to do there in terms of figuring out how to deal with all of these changes in a holistic way. But we do need to be aware still of all of these more simpler interactions like the ones I just talked about. Another thing that we know we don't know yet is we have this idea and we know that there will be a rise in invasive plants in the Northeast, but this is also just based on species that are already present in the US. So this, again, this study from Allen and Bradley in 2016 was done on close to 600 invasive plants that are already established in the US. What we have less of an idea of are plants, are novel invaders and novel plants that may be coming from places that we haven't experienced imports from yet. So this is a study from Bradley and colleagues in 2012, and what this is showing here are our established sources of nursery imports, and then also some emerging sources. So over the past many years, we've had lots of imported invasive plants and nursery imports generally from countries like Canada, Mexico, China, and we're already really used to these plants coming into the country. But what we haven't had yet are many plants from places like Africa or a few countries in South America or Northern Europe. And that's problematic because there are all sorts of plants that we have no idea yet whether they'll become invasive in the US. So there could be an entire pool of species coming into the US that we aren't even on the lookout for yet. So this is something to be aware of moving forward, that there may be totally novel plants coming into the US with climate change and into the future. All right. So that is kind of the brief overview of some of the things that we expect to see with invasive species and climate change and how those two global change factors might interact moving forward. And now I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about the Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Group, so this risk management network. And so I want to introduce to you all the leadership team behind this. So these are the risk co-founders. They include Bethany Bradley, who's a professor at UMass Amherst, Toni Lamorelli, she is a research ecologist with the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, which is a USGS facility, and then also Carrie Brown-Lima. So she is the director of the New York Invasive Species Research Institute. So these are our risk leaders, and then there's an entire team of us that work on generating materials and helping run risk. So the risk network mission statement here. So the goal of risk is that we aim to reduce the compounding effects of invasive species and climate change by synthesizing relevant science, communicating the needs of managers to researchers, building stronger scientist-manager communities, and also conducting priority research. And this is our website here, and I'll show this a few more times, but I would highly recommend going to the RISC website in order to take advantage of some of the materials that RISC has already created. But yeah, the main goal of RISC is to work with people who are managing invasive species and to help open up that communication between managers and researchers so that researchers know what managers need and managers know what's going on with the most current scientific research. And the reason why we're doing this, so this comes from one of our RISC members, so Eve Bury. So this is a survey of invasive species managers, over 200 managers, mostly in the Northeast. And what we saw by doing this survey is that for invasive species management alone, our managers identified the biggest barriers to success, so these gray bars, being funding and personnel. But when we ask them, what are the biggest areas of, what are the biggest barriers to incorporating climate change into your invasive species management, we see these red bars here. So this access to information and availability of information both shoot up. So what we're seeing from this is that a lot of our managers are maybe interested in figuring out how to include climate change in their invasive species management, but that there either isn't a lot of information for them out there, or they're having a hard time getting a hold of the relevant information. And so at Risk, we're trying to help our managers get these resources. So how can Risk help? So we have some resources. The first thing that Risk does is we create research summaries. And so what these research summaries are our current research papers that we summarize with managers in mind. So it's a quick summary of the paper, followed by some take-home points, and then also what that means for managers. And so these research summaries are sent to everybody on the Risk Listserv, and they go out about every other week. And I will show you all how to join the Risk Listserv after this if you're interested in receiving these research summaries. But the goal behind these is to help our managers keep up with the most up-to-date scientific literature on what's going on with invasive species and climate change, because we know that our managers are very busy on the ground and don't have time to keep up with all of the research that's constantly coming out. So this is one way to help people keep up with what's going on. The next thing that we do is create these management challenges. So I'll show you some examples of those. They are these 2-page documents. They can be downloaded from the website. And what these documents do is summarize one aspect of, each one will have an aspect of invasive species and climate change, and it synthesizes information from many sources into one really easy to digest, quick to read 2-page document. So this one in the middle here, Double Trouble, that includes all of the information that I talked about in the first part of this presentation. So if you ever want to review that, you can go back to this Double Trouble challenge and get an idea of these major interactive effects with invasive species and climate change. This taking action piece, for example, came from our manager survey. And what we did here is we summarized all of the ways that our managers are telling us that they've already incorporated invasive species and climate change together into their invasive species management. So you could go to this document for ideas on how to include climate change and invasive species management where you are, because these are ways that people have already been able to combine these two things into their management strategies. The top left one here, this Why Native document, we've heard from our managers that this has been really useful for them as outreach material. So this will potentially help people, if you're doing outreach, help convince people about why it's important to plant native species in their home gardens. And we've heard that that's been useful for manager outreach. So all sorts of options here. There are more management challenges on the Risk website. So there may be other information on those that might be useful to you. So I'd recommend taking a look at those. Another thing that has come out of Risk is this invasive species watchlist tool. And so I've shown this figure a few times. So again, these more than 800 species, looking at US species that may invade the Northeast. And with each of these species, they were generated using species distribution maps based on future climate conditions. And with each species that was analyzed here, we ended up, analyzed by Jenica Allen and Bethany Bradley. So this 2016 study, there was a distribution or multiple distribution maps associated with each of these species. So the idea here is how can we turn these distribution maps into a tool so that people can see what invasive species are actually possibly going to invade the areas that they're managing. And so Jenica Allen, she's the campus living lab director at Mount Holyoke College now. She worked to put together this tool to identify range shifting invasive plants. So this tool can be accessed on EdMaps. In this range shifting, here's the address for accessing that. And what you can do with this tool is select your, so it's a customizable tool, and you can select your state or counties that you're interested in. You can also choose the total number of models that you want to agree. So these expansions are based on 13 different climate models. So you can choose how many models you want to agree to decide whether there's a low to high likelihood that a species will invade in your area. And you can then generate a list of species that may, or that will have suitable climate space in your area of interest. And so this is an example watch list that was generated for New York and New England. So these are species that are not yet established in these areas. The top section here are ones that could establish now and also establish by 2050. And then the bottom part of this list are species that will have a suitable climate in New York and New England by the year 2050, so based on our climate models. And this is based on high model agreements, looking at 11 out of 13 models agreeing that these species could establish here. But that's a really long list, and that can be really tough to manage with. So another thing that RISC is working on is helping people prioritize these watch list species. So again, there's over 100 species on this list. So we're going to try to help people prioritize these species, and one way that we can do that is by completing impacts assessments. So the tool that this group has chosen to use is ICAT, so the Environmental Impact Classification for Alien Taxa. And this requires that you read the titles and abstracts of all peer-reviewed papers about that species of interest, and then identify all papers that measure impacts. So we have two people who have been working on this. The first is Mai Rockwell Postel, and she was an undergrad student working on her honors thesis at UMass. And she worked on these impact assessments for all of the species in southern New England and southern New York. And then we also have Bridget Griffin, who was a research associate in Bethany Bradley's lab and a part of the RISC group. And she was working on all of the species in northern New York and northern New England. And so these ICAT assessments basically break down ecological impacts from minimal to major concern. So these minimal concern, if a study says that there's no discernible impact or no effects on native species, this would be a minimal concern, all the way up to major concern. So does the study say that there will be changes to the composition of an entire native community based on the introduction of this invasive species? So the example they give here is that this Bell 1997 study found that Arundodonax increased fire frequency, which could alter the community composition of riparian forests. So this would be a major concern impact. It also does take into account whether there are agricultural, economic, or human health impacts. So we get a little more specific with our ecological impacts, and then also look at any of these additional impacts that could also be of major concern. And so using that assessment, we were able to identify 5 major impact plants in southern New England and New York. And so these plants were Burr Sherville, giant reed, slender oat, water primrose, and then elmleaf blackberry. So the example here is Arundodonax, for example, this giant reed. Its impact is that it can outcompete native wetland plants, alter wetland structure, increase fire frequency, and also act as a host crop for pests and pathogens. So these are some of the impacts that the plant can have. And we also determined that the Northeast had high vulnerability to this because it invades habitats that we know are already in the Northeast. So once all of the ICAT assessments are completed, as a group, we've gone back through and helped pick out really the ones that we think that the Northeast might actually be vulnerable to. And remember too, that we are thinking about these plants in terms of they have this high ability to disperse to New England because people are moving them around. So even though it seems like maybe Arundodonax is pretty far away from most of our states now, we know that it has the ability to travel up here. So these are some of our high-risk plants for southern New York and New England, and we are working on turning these into another management challenge. So people will be able to look at these lists and these summaries very quickly and figure out whether these are plants that they should be on the lookout for. We're still currently working on invasive plants for northern New England and New York. So for all of you folks up in Vermont, these lists are still to come, but so far there have been 83 species that needed to be assessed, and there have been 54 completed to date, so we're getting there. The species with major impacts so far include porcelain berry, orange butterfly bush, paper mulberry, lespedeza, stiltgrass, and kudzu. And once we do get this list of major impacts, we'll go back through these species. So this is a preliminary list, and when we go back through the species, we will determine whether we think that the northeastern native systems are actually vulnerable to invasion by each of these. So yeah, more to come on this, and once we do have a final list, it'll likely be generated into another management challenge that you'll be able to access. So you may be wondering, what do we do with these high impact watch list species? Because it can be tough to manage these things. And what we're hoping for a lot of these species that have yet to arrive are that they can be proactively listed. So working to get these species regulated or onto watch lists for your state so that people know to be aware of them, and maybe we can up some of this early detection and also potentially regulate the sale of invasive species that are on these lists if they're not already regulated in your area. But this means that in a lot of cases, species will need to be listed before they arrive in your state. And so what this chart is showing is the regulated invasive plant lists for each of the northeastern states, including New York and Pennsylvania. And what it shows is that you can see Vermont here is the second plot over. It shows how widespread species on these lists are before they're listed. So Vermont is actually doing pretty well in terms of their listed species, and that a lot of the species listed in Vermont aren't already totally widespread in the state. So there may be some regulatory space to keep new species from being introduced. But what you can also see is that for pretty much all of these states, there are species that are listed already that haven't arrived in the state yet. And so there is room on these lists for species that haven't arrived yet. And one example of this, so if you remember here, this kudzu vine, which you may have heard about in the southern US, that we expect to be able to expand to a lot of the Northeast, including northern New York and New England. That species is already listed as a regulated plant in New Hampshire. So they're already ready to keep that species from coming into the state. The last thing that I'm going to talk about are these risk events. So risk, in addition to providing all of these materials online and through our listserv, we do host symposia every year, whether those are at UMass or our own risk symposia, or whether they're part of a larger event. So this past year we hosted with the North American Invasive Species Management Association conference. We did our own special session and workshops. And at these events, we've worked really hard to bring together managers and researchers to talk about that exchange of information and try to see if people are on the same page. We've also workshopped some of our management challenges there to make sure that they are useful to the people that they're supposed to be useful for. So the best way, or one of the best ways to keep up with all the things Risk is doing, is to join our listserv. So you can email that address to join it. You can also go to the Risk webpage and find instructions for joining the listserv there. So here's the website. Again, our listserv, if you're interested in joining the listserv. This is the web address for the Watchlist tool. And then also I'm going to put in a plug here for a webinar coming up on May 6th. So this is coming out of the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. And this is looking on forest adaptation studies in the Northern Forest. And yeah, I'd recommend attending that webinar if that's something that you're interested in. All right, so to go back through these conclusions, So in terms of how we expect invasive species and climate change to interact, we see that invasives are likely going to emerge earlier, have longer and more life cycles for our invasive pests, and they're also generally more competitive with warming temperatures. We also know that our invasive species are range shifting and that people are helping them move, but this also means that we have a chance to get ahead of some of them. And this goes back to this idea of knowing what species to look out for in your area. We also know that climate extremes can create novel disturbances, and that's going to favor our invasives. So to be on the lookout for disturbance events and how those might impact the invasives and native species in the areas that you're managing. And then we also know here that invasive plants have this growth advantage with higher atmospheric CO2. So while both of our native and non-native plants, or native and invasive plants are going to do better, our invasive plants are going to do even better still than our native plants with these higher CO2. And that's been shown in about as many species as we've studied so far. And then the final thing is that RISC is an organization that's here to help keep you up to date on how to incorporate climate change into your invasive species management. And we do that by providing materials of the latest science behind climate change and invasive species interactions. All right, so again, join our listserv if you would like to keep up with what goes on with the RISC network. Also visit our website, and I will take any questions.
Great. Thanks, Emily. That was really great to hear about what you guys are doing with RISC there. We do have a couple questions coming in here, so I'll work my way through them. So the first one is, does RISC work with any partners on prevention of invasive species introduction? And the second part to that is, are there any cities that are setting a precedent in monitoring and inspecting for invasives coming in?
So for looking at new invasives, one thing that RISC has been doing is working with, we've been working with the different state IPCs, so the invasive plant councils, and one thing we're working right now on are weed risk assessments and trying to figure out ways to help states coordinate with each other a little better so that they're not duplicating effort with all of these weed risk assessments. And so we've been in very close contact with state IPCs, for example. And then what was the second part of the question?
The second part of the question was, are there any cities that are kind of setting a precedent for, let me get back to here, for inspecting for invasives coming in?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, so I don't know about any specific cities that are doing particularly well, for example, with inspections. I'm not as familiar with the inspection and enforcement side of things. That's something that RISC hasn't quite tried to dive into yet.
Great, thanks. All right, I'm going to try and pair a couple of these questions together here that are somewhat related. One was on how is it possible that we're still allowing so many non-native plants into the U.S. and what could be done to prevent this? And along those lines, a second question that kind of came in was, seems that there may be a need to encourage more wild forests and reduce road networks and work forests. Would you agree that that's one avenue to reducing that?
Yeah, so as far as importing invasive plants, our like horticultural industry, for example, there's a lot of money there. They have a lot of power. So a lot of this has to do with money and politics. And the vast majority of plants that do get brought in that aren't native here, they don't become invasive. So it's pretty difficult to say that you can't have any new plants, because such a small number of them do actually become invasive, even though those small number end up causing huge problems. So a lot of it's a political issue. A lot of it is that we don't have great regulatory and enforcement power in these cases either. So it feels like an uphill battle, but some of the first steps are getting these species, listed. So even if at the national level, maybe a lot of species are still coming in, getting that at the state level. So getting your state plant lists, to respond to some of these emerging threats is a really good way to go, and maybe where some of, people at our level might have a little more power. So yeah, that's one side of it. And then the second part of that question was, on road networks. Yeah, so we know that invasive plants do spread along roads. So there's definitely potential that in, working forests, for example, if people are traveling, they can spread invasive seeds further into the forest, which can be problematic. I don't know about if you were to look at, I would think that also these roads are also in some cases probably necessary or providing some positive as well. So I think a lot of that is going to be balancing the positive aspects of these roads with, the potential for invasion and intrusion of invasive species deeper into a forest. So I'm not sure about roads specifically or how those forests are managed. But if you're concerned about maybe a highly sensitive area or maybe a rare community, I would definitely think about, ways to keep those propagules, those seeds from getting in to begin with, and maybe limiting road use would be a way to do that.
Great, thanks. Let's see. So we've got one question here that you kind of addressed there and a little bit in your talk as well, which was how might land clearing or new development impact invasive species dispersal? You made it pretty clear about how they kind of thrive in disturbed areas, but how about dispersal?
The big thing being that with new development, there's more disturbance usually means more invasives. As far as dispersal goes, some of those mechanisms are going to be with machinery for clearing new land. Seeds getting stuck on machines and then going to new areas is always a problem. So those kinds of accidental dispersals are really important. So that would be something where, regulating cleaning machines before moving them between areas might be an important thing to do, or making sure that something is, clean before it comes into your area. And if they're being developed into places where people are going to be, as soon as you have people moving into an area, there's always that potential that there might be hitchhiking seeds that can now disperse from that area, get onto people, and then move outside of that area as well.
Great, thanks, Emily. Looks like I've got a couple more here. I'll try and merge these two together as well. One question came in about whether or not you know of any tools that allow managers to identify portions of the landscape through GIS for enhancing monitoring of invasive species. And I guess kind of the follow-up to that would be, does RISC provide any information on methods to physically manage invasive species in the field?
Okay, so as far as like spatial tools to look at invasives, one thing that I would recommend is, if you aren't looking at EDMAPS yet, to look at EDMAPS that has occurrence information for a ton of invasive species. So EDMAPS is this early detection and rapid response mapping system that focuses on these new introductions, so potentially like single plant introductions, as well as larger populations of invasives. But one thing that you can get is spatial information from that site for a whole slew of invasives, and you could potentially see maybe how close some of these are to some of the areas you're managing. So that would be one recommendation. As far as like an actual geospatial tool to work on that, I'm not familiar with a tool specifically, just some places where that kind of information is generated, like EDMAPS. As far as actual management protocols, RISC does not typically recommend to managers certain strategies like different herbicide applications or anything like that. We're more a vehicle for helping put you in touch and get you networking with the managers that you would want to be talking to get that kind of information. So one of the things that we often recommend is that managers who are further north, start talking to managers to their south and see what kinds of strategies they're using, what kind of plants or other invasive species they're already dealing with, so that they can get an idea of things to come. And then if they're dealing with some of the same species, how their strategies for managing them might be different. So we would recommend that you talk to other managers directly, and risk as a network can help bring those groups of people together.
Great, thanks, Emily. I'll just add a little bit to that. If the person asking the question is from Vermont, you can visit vtinvasives.org, and there's a lot of great resources there as well for management of particular species. It's looking like I think all the questions that were in that box have been answered at this point. So it is 10 a.m., so I think we're coming to a close here. I'd like to thank Emily one more time for giving us a great webinar and kicking this series off in an excellent fashion. Let's see, as I mentioned early on in the webinar, as you click out of this, there should be a survey that pops up with questions about your credits if you seek those out. If for some reason that does not auto-generate, you will be emailed that survey. So don't worry if it doesn't show up for some reason. Last thing is that we'll be doing this again next week. We have a couple great speakers. They're going to be talking about pathogens in oak species within the Northeast. And details on that will be announced today or tomorrow via another email similar to what you had to register for this one. So hope you all can attend that, and looking forward to it. Have a great week, and thanks again, everybody.
Yeah, thank you all.